The barrel of a rifle pressed against her forehead, and Sister Miriam sneezed. The gunman jolted back in surprise as if holiness might have sprayed on him, and for a split second the other hostages muffled nervous laughter. The leader barked for silence, but Miriam simply dabbed at her nose with the sleeve of her habit and said in the calmest tone, "I warned you the chapel was dusty." That one line cracked the tension like lightning through stained glass. It made her captors uneasy because none of them had ever seen a hostage behave like that. The monastery had always been a quiet place, perched high on the ridge where the morning mist rolled like unspooled silk. But that dawn was shattered by boots pounding against marble, shouts echoing through the cloisters, and the heavy slam of rifle butts against sacred doors. The armed men came with balaclavas and arrogance, convinced they had seized an easy prize, a cluster of harmless nuns who prayed more than they spoke. They did not know that one of those women had prayed in deserts where bullets screamed louder than bells. They gathered everyone in the central hall. The frescoes of angels looked down with patient detachment as the hostages knelt on cold stone. Sister Miriam was placed at the center, her hands bound with rough cord. She hummed an old hymn under her breath, not in defiance, but in rhythm. The captors assumed she was trembling. They did not realize she was counting. One hum for each guard, each rifle, each window, each mistake they made. The leader strutted in with a swagger that was almost theatrical. He was tall, young, and far too eager to prove himself. His voice echoed when he announced to his men that the government would have no choice but to negotiate. They had a nun, after all. A symbol of purity. A bargaining chip that would draw the eyes of the world. His men nodded, some sneering at the hostages, some already dreaming of ransom money. Miriam lowered her head as though in submission. But her lips formed a faint smile, because she had seen their kind before. Men who thought violence was control. Men who thought faith was weakness. She let her gaze drift to the candles flickering against the altar, already imagining how their dripping wax might become more than decoration. One of the younger militants was assigned to watch her. He tried to intimidate her, leaning close, his breath hot with nerves. "Do you fear death?" he whispered. Miriam looked him in the eye and said, "Only if it comes before lunch." The absurdity of it made the boy snort before he remembered he was supposed to be terrifying. He shoved her shoulder, but his push was weak. Around them, the other nuns clutched rosaries and whispered frantic prayers. They truly were helpless. Miriam knew her sisters had no idea who she once was. To them she was the quiet woman who tended the gardens and sang low hymns in the evenings. They did not know about the calluses hidden beneath her sleeves, the faint scar along her collarbone from a sniper's recoil, the long nights in deserts where her only prayer had been for steady aim. The hours dragged. Negotiators on the outside stalled, afraid to storm the monastery with so many innocents at risk. The militants grew restless, pacing the hall, arguing about demands. Miriam stayed motionless, observing. She counted the rhythm of their footsteps, the way their leader barked orders that were ignored more often than followed, the nervous twitch of the one who kept glancing at the windows. She marked weaknesses like a chess player setting pieces in her mind. When one of the guards grew bored, he taunted Miriam, demanding she bless his rifle. He shoved the barrel under her chin, daring her to pray over it. Miriam looked at the weapon, tilted her head, and murmured, "I can bless the man holding it, but the rifle is already cursed." Laughter broke from the hostages despite their fear. The guard flushed, and the leader snarled at them to shut up. But the damage was done. A single nun had made them look ridiculous. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The hostages grew quiet, exhausted from kneeling. The militants grew careless, snapping at one another. Miriam's wrists burned from the rope, but she flexed her fingers gently to keep circulation flowing. Her gaze moved upward to the choir loft, where a familiar shape sat hidden beneath dust cloths. It had been years since she'd last touched it, but she knew it was there, the rifle she had hidden when she left that life behind. She had thought she would never need it again. She had been wrong. The leader approached her then, crouching to meet her eyes. His smile was cruel. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "we will put you on camera. The world will see you beg. You'll pray for mercy before dawn. Miriam lifted her chin, her voice steady. I already said my prayers, she replied. You should say yours. The words were simple, but the weight of them unsettled even hardened men. Some shifted uncomfortably, muttering under their breath. The leader forced a laugh, but his eyes flickered. He had wanted a trembling victim. Instead, he had a woman who looked at him as though he were the one in chains. The hall fell silent after that, save for the crackling of candle flames. The hostages dared not speak. Miriam closed her eyes as though drifting into prayer, but inside her head she was already mapping the night. She had counted rifles, exits, weaknesses. She knew where she would need to be when dawn came. She knew how many lives she could save and how many she would have to take. She breathed slow, steady, as she once had on mountainsides and rooftops, with crosshairs aligned on men who never saw her coming. Back then she had been a soldier. Now she was a nun. But tomorrow, she would need to be both. The guard nearest her yawned, leaning his weapon against the wall. The others argued in low voices about food and ransom. Miriam's lips moved in silent prayer, but not for her own safety. She prayed for clarity, for timing, and for the courage to act when the moment came. She prayed for the frightened novices beside her, for the frightened men who thought they were strong, and even for the leader who did not realize he was already losing control. The candle flames swayed as though in agreement. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the promise of storm. Inside the monastery, no one slept soundly. The hostages feared death. The militants feared exposure. And Sister Miriam, the woman they thought was a helpless nun, feared only that she might be too late. By dawn, she told herself, they will learn what kind of nun they have taken. And if God willed it, they would never make that mistake again. Sister Miriam kept her eyes closed until the leader moved away, then opened them to the candlelight and the line of shadows where the balustrade of the choir loft cut a thin mouth in the dark. She counted quietly inside her head and let the numbers soothe her. Calm was a muscle. You exercised it until it held even under weight. She had learned that long before she put on a habit, in places where the sun cooked the earth into plates that cracked under boots, and the air tasted of iron. Back then the instructors told her to breathe on 4 beats, to watch the target on the inhale and take the shot on the exhale. The body obeys rhythm better than fear. She breathed now and let memory become a tool rather than a trap. Her first rifle had been issued with a joke and a shrug, as if no one could quite believe a slim 20-year-old would carry it farther and make it sing truer than men twice her size. Other recruits had scribbled names on their rifles and talked to them like pets. Miriam learned its language instead. The patience of the bolt. The honesty of recoil. The way wind curled over a valley and nudged a bullet in flight like a stern ant. She learned to be still longer than pain could nag her. She learned that pulling a trigger was not the act but the end of a conversation between eye and breath and decision. When the war took what it always takes and left what it always leaves, she put the rifle down and walked away. She did not think she would hear that language again. Then she found the monastery, the quiet of the garden, the humble tyranny of weeds, the long thin choir notes that rose like smoke. Silence felt like a miracle. She vowed to keep it. Now silence felt like a blade she had to hold by the edge. The men who had taken them were growing sloppy, and sloppiness could be harvested. The young guard assigned to her had the jittery energy of a person pretending to be cruel. He wore a scarf at his throat like a badge. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, and tried not to look at her face because her calm made him feel like a boy playing dress-up. He had not tied her wrists well. The rope burned at first, then numbed as her fingers worried small freedoms into the fibers. When he leaned close to check the knots, she said thank you so softly that he blinked, confused, and nearly said you're welcome before he remembered the script his leader had given him. She watched the leader, too, the way he squared his shoulders when he spoke to his men and rolled them when he turned away. Command sat on him like a borrowed coat. He demanded a broadcast in the morning because he needed an audience, not because he had a plan. He was careful around doors, less careful around people. That told Miriam where to push. A group like this did not hold together because of ideology alone. It held together by momentum and fear. Break either one and the whole contraption rattled apart. In the second hour after sunset, a clatter of trays from the kitchen broke the hall like a snapped string. Someone had finally remembered to feed the hostages. A novice nun no older than 19 carried a pot of thin stew, her hands shaking so badly that the ladle tapped the rim like a bell. Miriam saw her coming and angled her body so they would meet. The young woman had a small scar at her hairline and the fierce determination of someone who had not learned to hide it yet. She knelt beside Miriam and whispered a quick apology when a splash landed on the stone between them. "Do you trust me?" Miriam said, and it was the strangest thing to ask a stranger while bound and watched by men with rifles, but the novice's eyes cleared at once, as if trust was the only coin she could afford to spend. The girl nodded. Miriam said a phrase that sounded like a prayer but was a direction. 2 steps to the left when you leave. Then bend to tie your shoe. The novice blinked, then rose and did exactly that. The smallest shift in her path put her between the nearest guard and the far door for a heartbeat. The guard adjusted his stance to keep the steward balanced. In that adjustment he revealed the key ring tucked at the back of his belt and the slackness in the strap of his rifle. Miriam filed it away. A plan was a quilt made from scraps like these. The guard with the scarf grew bored and cocky and wanted laughter from his friends. He held up her rosary and demanded she show him how holy beads worked. He even mimed throwing them like a lasso, and the men chuckled. Miriam tipped her head and said, "It is a memory aid. Would you like a memory?" He smirked and leaned in, and she flicked her wrist with the smallest of movements. The beads slipped, and a single one snapped free and popped into his collar like a bee. Instinct trumped bravado. He swore and hopped back, clawing at his neck. The hall laughed. His flush deepened into anger and shame, but he could not shoot a nun over a bead. A moment later another guard teased him about being baptized and the tension released in a burst. Laughter had a way of loosening knots, including the ones that tied men to dumb ideas. While they laughed, Miriam eased her wrists a breath's width. She found the knot was mostly show. It would yield when asked firmly. Between the jokes came the low fights. 2 militants hissed at each other about ammunition, about who had wasted a magazine firing at a locked door that would not have opened for thunder itself. One muttered that the leader did not know what he was doing. The leader heard it, and pretended he had not. Miriam saw the flicker in his eyes and knew he would punish someone soon to make order feel real. If she timed her move wrong, he would use a hostage to do it. She let her thoughts climb the narrow stair in her memory to the choir loft, and found the shape waiting there, the one she had hidden when she arrived at the monastery years ago. The decision to keep it had felt like failure at the time. A lack of faith in the finality of her vow. She had wrapped it in cloth like a relic and promised herself never to touch it again. Now the promise bent under the weight of lives. She could hear 2 voices inside herself. The soldier said you planned for this without admitting you planned for it. The nun said tools are innocent until we decide their purpose. She thought of the girl's scar, of the old brothers whose knees would not survive a march to a firing line, of the cook who had tucked a wooden spoon into her sleeve as if it were a weapon. She let the soldier and the nun share the same breath. The morning came heavy with gray clouds that threatened rain, and the monastery seemed caught between silence and storm. The bells in the tower had not rung, though every hostage imagined hearing them. The militants busied themselves with preparations for the broadcast, stringing cables across the stone floor, setting up a battered camera stolen from some forgotten news van. They argued about angles and words, but none of them had the patience of true planners. They were men with rifles who thought the weight of steel could substitute for a strategy. Sister Miriam watched with lowered eyes, her wrists still bound, her mind tightening around the fragile strands of opportunity that had been gathering through the night. She had prayed for clarity, and clarity had come. It told her she would have to move soon or watch innocents die in front of the world. The outside world had already noticed. News vans were parked at the foot of the ridge, reporters whispering into microphones while pointing up at the monastery that sat like a wounded crown against the sky. Authorities debated endlessly, the sound of their radios carried faintly on the wind when the door cracked open. Some spoke of storming the monastery, others of waiting, fearing that rash action would doom the hostages. None of them knew that one of the women kneeling inside was more dangerous than the men with guns. They thought of her as a symbol, a fragile lamb. Miriam smiled inwardly at the thought. Symbols were sharper than knives if wielded properly. The novices and elderly brothers clung to hope with frayed fingers. Their eyes were hollow but still turned upward, as if heaven might intervene with thunder or miracle. Miriam wanted to tell them not to expect fire from the sky, but the right fire would come, and it would be born from her own steady hands. She whispered to the young novice with the scar at her hairline when the guards were distracted, asking if she had remembered the red cord in the sacristy. The girl nodded, her jaw tight with fear but also with something like pride. Trust once given could not be returned, only lived up to. As the militants prepared the broadcast, divisions among them grew sharper. Two of the men shouted about whether ransom or politics should be the demand. Another muttered that their leader was too concerned with appearances, and not enough with survival. The leader himself barked orders that fell flat, his charisma dwindling under the weight of doubt. Miriam noticed the way the younger ones looked at him, not with respect but with calculation, as though measuring how long he would last before he became a liability. It reminded her of soldiers she had seen in deserts who followed a commander until fear outweighed loyalty. The cracks were widening, and she knew how to pry them further apart. The first act of chaos came from one of the hostages. An older brother, desperate and shaking, made a sudden dash for the side door when a guard turned his head. It was a foolish attempt, driven by terror, and it should have ended in his death. The guard raised his rifle, but before the trigger could be pulled, the strap caught once again on the pillar where it had snagged the night before. Miriam had shifted the angle earlier, making the snag inevitable. The rifle jerked upward, the bullet tearing into the stone ceiling instead of the old man's back. The hall filled with dust and shouts. The old brother fell, but only from fright, not from a wound. The guard cursed and kicked at his strap, and the leader slapped him across the face in fury. The hostages gasped, alive by accident, though Miriam knew it had been no accident at all. The moment revealed something important. Miriam saw how the militants reacted. Some laughed at the guard's mistake, mocking him, while others whispered that it was a bad omen. Superstition spread through men like a stain. A nun who did not tremble, a rifle that misfired, an escape attempt that ended with dust instead of blood, these things gnawed at them. She encouraged it by bowing her head as though in deep prayer, her lips moving in a rhythm that made the nearest man edge away from her. Fear of the unseen was stronger than bullets. Later that day the leader strode across the hall, and yanked Miriam up by the rope around her wrists. He dragged her to the front of the hostages and demanded that she speak into the camera. She did not resist. He pressed the muzzle of his pistol against her temple and told her to beg the authorities for their demands. Miriam looked straight into the lens, her voice steady, and spoke not of fear but of courage. She told the world that the monastery was not afraid, that faith remained unbroken, and that violence could never be mistaken for strength. Her words made the leader slap her hard across the face, but the camera had already captured them. The militants shouted and cut the feed, realizing too late that the symbol they wanted to exploit had turned against them. Outside, the negotiators leaned forward, surprised by the poise of a woman they thought was fragile. Journalists murmured about her calm, and the world's eyes began to turn. When the leader stormed away, furious, one of his own men muttered that she had cursed the broadcast. Another said she looked like a soldier, not a nun. Miriam's blood ran still and cold at the words. They had seen too much in her posture, perhaps, or in the way she did not shake even with a gun against her skull. Later, when the leader returned to confront her, he noticed the faint tattoo on her wrist where the rope had rubbed her sleeve up. It was an old mark, the insignia of her former unit, a sniper's emblem she had thought forgotten. His eyes narrowed as he traced it with a dirty finger. He asked what it meant. Miriam told him quietly that it was the mark of someone who had lived through things he could never imagine. The leader stared for a long time, then forced a laugh, but it sounded brittle. He called her a fraud, a liar dressed in cloth. He shouted to his men that she was no nun but a spy. The hall rippled with tension. Some of the militants looked at her with awe, others with fear, still others with suspicion toward their leader for not noticing earlier. Rain hammered the roof until every beam seemed to hum with it, and when the leader hauled Miriam from the pillar at first light, the monastery felt like a ship in a storm crewed by men who had never seen the sea. He dragged her into the small chapter room beside the hall where old portraits watched from cracked frames. A single lamp burned on the table and turned his eyes into 2 dark coins. He liked this room because it made him feel private and powerful. He circled her the way stray dogs circle a bone, trying to decide what to do with it. He said she had embarrassed him in front of the world and asked if she understood the price of that mistake. Miriam nodded as if to a lecturing teacher, and he frowned because answers that did not tremble rarely satisfied men who needed fear more than truth. He asked about the tattoo on her wrist, and she said it belonged to a life she had already survived. He asked who sent her, and she said that no one had to send her because she had found her own way here. He leaned close enough for her to smell the sour edge of his breath, and said that he knew what she was. She said, "Very good, then you know the danger of leaving me with both hands and a plan." He jerked back as if the sentence had been a slap. He told her she was weak because she prayed, that prayer made people soft. She said prayer is weight training for the soul, you would like it if you could learn to lift anything heavier than your pride. His lips twitched. He wanted to laugh but could not afford it in front of his men, so he slammed his hand on the table to make the lamp wobble instead. He demanded the names of her unit, the kills she had taken, the orders she had followed. Miriam considered his questions the way a medic considers a wound, seeking the source rather than the blood. She said, "You shout because you cannot be sure your men still hear you. You pace because stillness lets doubt catch up. You choose a monastery because you hope that making holy ground bleed will make you feel like a man." She let her voice remain gentle, which made the words bite deeper. He called her a liar and turned away, but the portraits saw the stiffness in his shoulders. For a long moment he stood with his back to her, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he waved to the guard with the scarf and ordered her tied again. The scarfed guard tied the knot less carefully this time, as if ashamed to touch her, as if fear and gratitude had fused into a single clumsy feeling. On the way back through the hall, the novice with the scar met Miriam's eyes and looked toward the sacristy door. Miriam dipped her head by the smallest degree. The second the guard looked away, she twisted her wrists just enough to feel the knot ease. It would come free when called. She could not use that gift yet. Timing was a companion that punished impatience. She let the rope bite again and returned to the pillar as if defeated. The hostages sagged when they saw her, then steadied when they caught the calm that hung about her like a shawl. The rain lightened to a whisper. The leader arranged the camera for a second broadcast and ordered the youngest guard to rehearse his lines. The boy stumbled over the words and looked to Miriam as if she were a teacher who could fix a sentence. She offered a suggestion about speaking slowly, and the boy nodded before he remembered who he was supposed to be. Mockery rippled among the militants, thin and mean. Superstition had already gnawed at their edges, and now it began to chew bone. One man refused to cross the spot where the bullet had gone wild into the ceiling. Another muttered that the nun's eyes had made his stomach twist. A third swore he had heard a bell that no one else heard. Miriam gave them nothing more than silence, and a small smile not meant for them. When the leader was gone again, the novice came with a basin and cloths and asked to tend Miriam's cheek where the earlier slap had bloomed purple. The scarfed guard let her through with a grudging shrug. The girl held the cloth to the bruise and in that posture looked like an icon of mercy tilted forward into the ordinary. Miriam whispered that the red cord would open the side gate and that the bell signal would mean go now. The novice asked if she truly had been a sniper. Miriam said yes and waited for the recoil. The girl did not flinch. She said, "Then God must have a very steady hand if he has kept you this long." Miriam did not laugh, exactly, but the breath she let out felt lighter than the one she had drawn in. Later, when the guards shifted for food, Miriam studied the chapel with the eye of someone shopping for tools in a room built for prayer. A brass crucifix set into a wooden base could become a quiet persuader if the base were sharpened. Tall candles could become smoke and light to blind a doorway. A silver chalice, heavy and bottom-weighted, could be a hammer that apologized afterward. The sacristy held oil for the lamps, and old cassocks with cords that could bind or trip. The wine was thin and sweet and better suited to distraction than celebration. She did not love the thoughts that lined up in her mind, but she loved the people these thoughts might keep alive. The scarfed guard found her vision drifting and snapped that relics would not save her. Miriam said that relics are just memories you can hold, and I collect useful memories. He scowled, but he had listened the night before when she saved his pride by catching the rifle butt, and people are tender things even when they try not to be. He leaned in and said quietly that the leader was growing unhinged. She told him she knew. He said maybe there was a better way out for those who did not want a martyr's death. She looked at him with a softness that made him straighten, as if he had been allowed to remember the boy he had been before someone handed him a gun. He did not promise help and she did not ask. But when he walked away his pace was slower, the sign of a man who has started to think rather than merely obey. In the late afternoon the leader ordered a show of force. He dragged the oldest brother to the front and announced that the first shot on the next broadcast would be a warning. The line of hostages quaked. Miriam spoke then, not loudly but with a clarity that cut through panic. She said she would speak on camera if he let the old man rest. He agreed, because he thought a victory had just fallen into his hands. He did not see that he had taught his men that mercy could be negotiated. When the camera light blinked red, Miriam looked into the lens and gave a homily about fear dressing up as power. She thanked the world for watching and asked them to remember that people were not chess pieces. The feed cut again to shouting. But the hostages stood taller afterward, and that was what mattered. The storm broke for real at dusk, then softened to a drip that ticked off the eaves. The scaffolding of the day collapsed into the long patience of night. Miriam counted the rounds of the guards again, matched them to the settling sounds of the building, and felt the moment approach in small footfalls rather than trumpets. When the scarfed guard returned to her with a cup of water, his hand shook. He said that he had a cousin who had wanted to be a teacher, and that she had laughed like the novice did. He said he did not want to shoot anyone tonight. Miriam said then do not. He stared at her as if she had suggested moving a mountain with a spoon. But he left the knot at her wrists looser than before, a sliver of choice left blooming like a secret flower. The monastery woke to the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Rain had stopped but left everything slick, and the smell of wet stone filled the air. In the choir loft Miriam lay flat, the rifle braced against her shoulder, her cheek pressed to the stock as if it were a pillow from her past. Below her, the hostages shifted on stiff knees, eyes darting toward the militants who were more restless than ever. The leader strutted about, commanding that the camera be set up for a final demonstration. His voice cracked like old wood, loud but splintering. He wanted to show the world power, but Miriam could hear the edges of desperation. Desperation was useful. It made men predictable. The first rehearsal of their grand broadcast began. A hostage was dragged forward, trembling, while the leader rehearsed his speech about vengeance and justice. He wanted to fire a warning shot, but Miriam knew his finger itched for more than warning. She let the crosshairs slide over him, pausing at the hand that gripped the pistol. She could have ended it there, but the timing was not yet right. She needed the bell to sound, the novice to move, the guards to stumble into her traps. A single shot would only unleash chaos too soon. She waited, steady as stone, while the leader ranted to an audience that did not exist yet. When the guard with the scarf shifted near the gate, his eyes flicked upward, just for a breath, and Miriam knew he was aware of her. He did not give her away. Instead, he snapped at another guard to check the equipment. His voice carried enough authority now to draw nods. Miriam saw his choice forming, raw and unpolished, but choice nonetheless. He had become a crack in the wall of obedience, and cracks are where light begins. The novice nun sat close to the sacristy door, her fingers twisted in her habit. Miriam let her sight rest on the bell rope in her mind, rehearsing how it would feel to hear it tug twice. That would be the sign. But first the stage had to be set. The leader raised his pistol at the hostage, a young brother who could barely lift his head, and Miriam whispered into the scope as though it could carry her voice, "Not yet, hold on a moment longer. The leader lowered the gun, deciding he wanted a bigger spectacle with cameras rolling, and barked for his men to prepare the final recording at dawn's peak. That gave Miriam more time to weave the threads. The next hour crept forward. Guards shuffled, yawns betrayed exhaustion. One man snapped at another about stolen rations. Another muttered about omens and curses. Miriam marked them all, her scope sliding from face to face, engraving weaknesses into her patience. She breathed in rhythm, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, letting the rifle become a natural extension of her body. She remembered lying like this in deserts, in ruined cities, in hills where the only sound was wind. But those times had never held a choir beneath her or novices whispering prayers. Those times had never felt like faith braided with duty. Finally the leader stood before the camera, a hostage forced to kneel in front of him. The light flicked red. His voice boomed about punishment, about justice, about the strength of their cause. Miriam had heard men try to make words into shields before, but shields are useless when the hand behind them trembles. She slid the crosshairs over his head, then over his hand, then over the gun. Her finger rested against the trigger, slack, waiting for the exhale. But she did not fire yet. The novice had not moved. The bell rope still waited. Then the leader pressed the pistol under the chin of the hostage. That was enough. Miriam pulled once on the trigger, and the shot cracked through stone and air. The pistol flew from the leader's hand, knocked sideways in an explosion of splinters. Gasps erupted, both from hostages and militants. The hostage collapsed, alive. For a moment time froze. Then chaos shattered it. Men shouted, some firing blindly toward the loft, bullets sparking against stone. Miriam rolled aside, already reloading, letting the echoes mask her next position. She sighted another guard, the one closest to the novice, and sent him spinning backward with a bullet through the shoulder. Screams filled the hall. The leader howled orders, but half his men ducked instead of charging. Superstition had turned to panic. They had thought they held a lamb, but a wolf had risen in their midst. The novice jerked to her feet and sprinted to the sacristy. Miriam held her breath. The girl yanked the red cord, and with a groan the side gate creaked open. Sunlight streamed into the hall, pale and sharp. Hostages scrambled toward it, urged by the girl's frantic waving. Miriam shifted her scope, picking off 2 more guards who tried to block the escape. Each shot was a prayer spoken in the only language the men would understand. One for freedom, one for courage, one for mercy. She whispered blessings as she fired, half in jest, half in faith, telling each departing soul to run faster because God was giving them this chance. The leader raged like a storm trapped in a man's body. He grabbed the scarfed guard by the collar and demanded he lead a charge upstairs. The scarfed guard hesitated, eyes lifting once more to the loft. Miriam saw the choice solidify. He shoved the leader's hand away and shouted that he would not die for madness. That spark of defiance ignited others. 2 militants dropped their rifles and ran for the open gate, vanishing into the morning light. The leader turned his gun on them, firing wildly, but Miriam clipped his arm with a round, sending him spinning with a scream. Blood sprayed the fresco of an angel above the altar, red staining gold. Dawn spread across the ridge like a bandage laid over a wound, slow and careful, and the monastery breathed again. The last of the smoke curled out through broken windows, and the scent of rain diluted the bitterness of gunpowder until it was only a memory in the air. The gate that had been pried open by courage stood wide, its hinges groaning as if they too were tired of holding. The hostages gathered in the courtyard, blinking at the pale light, faces streaked with ash and tears and the relief that arrives only when fear finally unclenches its fists. Sister Miriam stepped down from the chapel, the rifle at rest against the altar behind her, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel nothing at all. Numbness can be a mercy when the heart is crowded. Sirens climbed the hill like a second chorus, and then froze at the threshold. Authorities entered with caution, weapons low, their eyes adjusting to the sight of monks and nuns in disarray and militants disarmed or fled. An officer approached Miriam, the usual questions gathering behind his tight mouth. Who was in charge, how many attackers, who had led the defense? Miriam answered simply and without drama, because drama had already had its turn. She said the novices and brothers had been brave, that several militants had surrendered, that the leader was dead by the altar where he had chosen to make his stage. The officer looked at her bruised cheek, then at her steady hands, and something like understanding softened his shoulders. He said that help had come, and she nodded with a small smile because help had been here all along, disguised as resolve and a bell rope. The scarfed guard sat on a step with his hands on his knees, his rifle a mute piece of metal at his feet. He looked younger in daylight, a boy who had put on a mask that did not fit and found it stuck. When an officer moved to cuff him roughly, Miriam put a hand on the officer's arm and asked for gentleness. She said he had made a choice that had saved lives. The officer hesitated, then nodded and signaled for calm restraint. The guard lifted his eyes to Miriam with a shame that ached to be useful and said that his cousin had wanted to be a teacher. He said he could still remember the sound of her laugh, and that he did not want to forget more. Miriam told him quietly that memory was a door, not a chain. He bowed his head and let himself be led away. Reporters hovered like moths at the edge of holy light, unsure how close they could fly without singeing their wings. One of them called out a question about the nun who had stood calm before a gun. Another asked whether rumors of a hidden rifle were true. Miriam felt the weight of eyes and did what she had done in darker rooms with louder voices. She stepped toward the camera and spoke plainly. She said the monastery had been held by fear and freed by courage, and that courage had many faces. She thanked the officers and medics. She asked the world that had watched to remember names more than headlines, and to tell the story of the novice who pulled a cord and led the old to safety. The camera caught her as she turned away, and the image would later circle the world, a woman in a plain habit with dust in her hair and a strange peace in her posture. The novice came to her then, the scar at her hairline bright against pale skin. Her eyes shone with the shock of surviving and the sudden weight of knowing what survival costs. She asked Miriam in a voice that trembled only a little whether she was a nun or a soldier. Miriam answered that she was both, and neither, and a servant first. She said God had given her steady hands and a place to use them, even when that place did not look like any church she had imagined. The novice took this in, as one takes in strong medicine, with gratitude and a grimace that soon becomes a smile. Then the novice surprised them both by making a small joke. She said that the paintball retreat planned for the youth would need to be postponed, since everyone would refuse to play against Sister Miriam. Laughter rippled through nearby throats like clean water finding a new path, and someone said they would only agree to paintball if Sister Miriam took the other team. Medics moved among the injured, efficient and kind, and the courtyard filled with a low hum of tending. Miriam walked that circle and paused at each bedroll or bench to press a hand, to say a word, to let her calm be borrowed by those who needed it. She prayed silently over the wounded militants as well as the wounded innocents. She did not ask forgiveness for them. She asked for a chance that they might one day forgive themselves and choose differently when fear came knocking with easy answers and heavy guns. When she reached the body of the leader, covered now by a simple cloth, she stood for a long moment. She did not feel triumph. She felt only the ache of what could have been if pride had not drowned him. She whispered a prayer for his soul that did not excuse him, and did not condemn him either. It was a prayer for truth to find the places where lies once lived,